Hello and welcome to YAGR. This is our deep dive on Sundered by ThunderLotus Games. I'd like to add a disclaimer that there is a mini-boss, a few attempts on the first full boss, as well as a couple lines of lore within this video. It does not spoil anything in particular, however it should be noted for those of you who are very concerned about spoilers. Our gameplay team has had roughly 20 hours of in-game time spent playing and is over 70% complete with the game currently. We're going to go through graphics and sound first. As stated before, all of the art and animations in this game are hand-drawn, truly beautiful, absolutely lovely. The creature style throughout the game is particularly interesting. I would love to know the inspiration behind a lot of the mid and late game enemies that you end up fighting, because they're kind of hellscapey and it's really interesting. It does not fit in with what you're initially introduced to, which is mechanical things, little floating robots, stuff like that. So there's some really interesting art contrast, especially as you move through the regions, which you'll hear more about when we go over the map. But one of the things that really irked me about the graphics and art of the game is there are a couple moments, not a lot. I only noticed it really in the first region a few times, and then in one of the later regions, but it was in a different scenario, and I'll explain here. The game is already difficult enough. It's quite challenging. Myself and the playthrough team are playing on normal, and we're having some challenges, particularly where we're currently at in the game, around 73% completion. And the folks at ThunderLotus Games decided to, in some cases, arguably artificially increase the difficulty through the use of art, particularly the foreground assets. In more than one scenario, the foreground assets cover up something that indicates a danger or a trap, and can sometimes be fairly problematic. We found ourselves running into the same trap multiple times after doing multiple iterations of a run, because there was a bit of foreground that was covering half of the little light that turns red when the trap's going to go off, and we'd lose like half our health. So I don't know if that was an intentional design to add a little bit of an additional challenge, but frankly I don't think it was really necessary. I think the game's challenging enough, and that's kind of a gimmicky way to make the game a little harder. But it wasn't a long-term issue. It was mostly in this first jungly region. The other point that I noticed it was a thing was in the cathedral region closer to the end of the game, and there are these portions of structures that kind of hang down and enemies can hide up inside of them, but that provides a more mechanical use and is challenging when enemies are there when it is supposed to be challenging. I feel like that's a more appropriate use of the foreground, background, and playing ground that you have when it's a mechanical function for the enemies to use versus hiding a component of a trap that the player should be reasonably aware of. None of the traps in this game are designed to, go, oh, gotcha. It's kind of like a maze or a puzzle and a timing thing is the feeling that I got playing through it. And that's the major complaint I have about the graphics. Some of the larger scale enemies get it kind of looks almost a little pixelated, and I have the game set to high graphics, but that's probably just because they have the drawing stretched a little bit, and frankly, it doesn't detract from the gameplay. It's still really cool looking graphics. So that pretty much wraps up the art portion of it, and we're going to go over sound. I really only have one thing to say about sound. I think the music's good, the sound effects are great. When you're swinging your weapon, it feels so good because you have that impactful thud and slash every time you attack. But one thing I do want to say about it is there is a component of the game that the player is robbed of if they are in a situation where they either can't hear the sound or have the sound turned down for whatever reason, and that's there are sound cues for when large hordes of enemies are coming your way, as well as when some certain traps are about to trigger. So in situations where not only is the visual cue blocked by something they've placed in the foreground, if you don't have access to audio or you're hearing impaired or something like that, then you are at a disadvantage playing the game, which has felt kind of strange. There were some times where there was some other sound going on, or I had to have the sound down low, and I was taken by surprise by some hordes of enemies, which isn't a big deal, but particularly when the traps get you because all you had was the audio cue due to some kind of foreground effect they had going on. That was kind of frustrating, and it felt a little unnecessarily gimmicky. Next, we're going to talk about the plot. Bosses and progression typically give you a little bit of story. This shard that's lending you power and trying to supposedly help you get through the dungeon and escape provides you little snippets of information about the bosses that you can piece together with other areas of plot that you're getting. On top of that, there are these crystallized rooms, basically, where you can activate these nodes and the shard will trigger and tell you a little bit of backstory or history about the world. I think it's a really creative way to tell a story, and I like it because there's not a lot of emphasis on building the main character as the focal point. It's more about building the world and building this being that you're working with as the focal point. Esh could literally be replaced with somebody else, and it wouldn't particularly impact the story whatsoever because it's about this world. So I think that's really cool and clever the way they did it, as well as their capability to tell a story without forcing it at you. In fact, you could go through most of the game and not find out any of the story if you didn't want to. But I highly recommend you do. It's quite interesting. The comments made about Esh being able to be more or less completely replaced by any other generic character is the biggest drawback to the plot. And it's not only for Esh, but outside of this monster crystal being God, whatever it may be, that is helping you, you don't really care about any of the characters. I don't find myself caring about Esh. I think she was in the wrong place at the wrong time and got unlucky. You get a little bit of snippets about the bad guys that you end up fighting, particularly the bosses. Maybe one snippet about a certain type of enemy here and there. And it doesn't feel like it adds too much, other than hearing the really cool voice and language that they used for this shard being. It doesn't make me feel anything towards any of the characters or any of the things I'm fighting. It's not necessarily a problem, but as far as plot goes, you don't really care too much about the character, but you certainly care about the world. So I think that was a design choice. I don't think that was any kind of accident or failure, but don't expect to learn too much about the character you play. Expect to learn about the world, essentially. Next, we're going to go over a couple different focal points of mechanics, starting with everyone's favorite, combat mechanics. This is going to get into what we talked about in our first impressions and what has and hasn't remained true, as a lot has changed. A few things that haven't changed is the fighting still feels very good. It feels like it's at the right place where the complexity of combat increases at the right point and the right pace. What kind of enemies you fight is directly associated with what kind of abilities you have at your disposal, and that is kind of gauged based on, you unlock this ability and that will enable you to go to this area, and that's the first place that you can find these creatures or monsters or enemies, essentially. So I think the pacing of the enemies and the toolkit you have to deal with the enemies is balanced and timed appropriately, and that was one of my concerns initially, is I only have so many tools in my toolbox to deal with these crazy different scenarios of hordes and hordes and hordes of enemies. But that certainly does not remain the case. Your combat becomes more and more complex as you go through and unlock things, as is standard in a Metroidvania game, in addition to getting some other progression mechanics, such as perks and stat increases and things like that. So the combat does get more complex. It enables the player to do quite a bit more, and I am very happy about that change. I think that's important, and it makes you feel like you're evolving and progressing through the game. I was a little worried it was going to stay more or less the same, but it certainly doesn't. The air combat is absolutely gorgeous and extremely integral. In fact, it is required to beat the game. Pretty much every boss, you have to do aerial combat, which I think is cool because they did a great job creating this aerial combat system. But for those players who aren't a fan of the flighty control scheme and just can't get used to it no matter how long they play the game, it can be a problem and it can really stunt your progression. So it should be noted. But the longer I've played this game, and this goes the same for my entire play team, the longer you play it, the more you grow accustomed to the movement set, and the more and more comfortable it feels, and you realize this is exactly where it should be. The movement and controls and just how floaty you are and just how far you move and things like that. It's very well designed. It's exactly where it needs to be. It just doesn't feel like that right off the bat because it's a little bit different, a little bit more fluid. And as far as enemies go, we talked a little bit about this before. There are quite a large number of enemies, in fact. And it's not just things that run at you. You have the standard little guys that you've been seeing, and we've talked about in the first impressions that the game starts out with, but this repertoire of enemies quickly and almost out of control grows to a massive amount of different mechanics you have to be aware of at any given time. You have things that just flat run at you. You have things with attack animations that track you differently. You have things that shoot at range and fly through walls and do these leaping mechanics. And when you start getting these massive hordes of 30 to 70 creatures coming to attack you at any given time, all doing different things, evading you or attacking you or blocking you or shooting from, 3 or 4 rooms away, it becomes just this cluster of manic movement. Basically, if you stop moving at any given time, you are in deep trouble. So I think the enemy design is actually really intricate and really complex, and I think it introduces it at a good pace, but I think it's very easy for players to be overwhelmed if they're not comfortable in a Metroidvania type setting or a general side-scroller type setting, and it will slow the learning curve of some players down. I think that's perfectly fine. I think that's part of picking up a new game, is you're learning it and getting better at it, and it feels really, really good when you get better at it. But for some people who have only played FPS their whole life, Sundered might not be the smartest first Metroidvania pick. That being said, it is an excellent one, and if you're willing to put the time in, that's great. But it is pretty unforgiving as you progress through the game, especially with the design of enemies. I love it, though. I think the difficulty is great. Also, for combat, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and I'm going to mention it now and go into more detail when we hit progression, but you basically get to unlock more and more combat functions, and it's not just combat functions that impact your combat, but also platforming functions through standard Metroidvania progression systems, as well as some other kind of nuanced, fun little things they added in, such as challenge areas to reach new things, including a couple different attack patterns and things like that. You get a larger repertoire of things you can do and things you can link together that enable you to adapt on the fly to tougher and tougher situations. So not only do you get comfortable with these combat mechanics, but you get to evolve them and combine them as well, which is a nice little intricate system to really push combat to the next level in a game like this. Next, we're going to go over platforming mechanics. The platforming mechanics have an interesting feeling to them. Sometimes it feels like you've jumped high enough, but you didn't actually, and you just fall back through the platform. I think that's common in most platform games, and it stops being an issue the longer you play the game, much like a lot of these other complaints that I may list off. But it's things that players should be aware of if they're looking at buying the game. That way they don't feel like they got cheated out of something and it doesn't feel the right way to them. It will, just give it time. It's a complex game that's got everything calculated down to the T. Just give it time to show you that it is. That's my recommendation to players on the fence about Sundered, because it certainly is well designed, especially with regards to platforming. Platforming, when combined with combat in particular, does feel super amazing. The ability to evade attacks. Not only do you have rolls and you eventually get an aerial dash and you can jump off walls and things like that, the platforming is integral for evading attacks, but it's also helpful when you're trying to set up attacks and combos because it helps you position in different locations. and the merger of your platforming upgraded abilities enabling you to do cooler combos and movements, especially with the aerial combat, when put together, is super awesome. You're jumping around doing all these crazy acrobatic strikes in, up, down, left, and right all at the same time, and then you float down and double jump and bounce off the wall and do all these crazy different things. It meshes so well together, I think. They've linked combat and platforming in a truly gorgeous way. I think that's not unique to Sundered, but it is certainly something important to get right, and ThunderLotus Games absolutely got it right. Platforming and combat together feels very good. I know I say that, but there is one exception, and this is probably the most glaring issue I have with the game. Now, this could be just me as a player not mechanically being able to utilize it properly, but it feels like it's an issue, and that is later in the game you get a grappling hook. It's not that, far to imagine, and it's not a particular spoiler. One of the upgrades you get is a grappling hook. This grappling hook can target specific hook points on the map, as well as enemies. That can be cool and useful, but it can also be very, very annoying when you start hooking to the wrong things, because there doesn't seem to be an established priority of hook points over enemies. You pretty much just point in a direction and hit the grapple button and hope you grapple to the right thing. When you have an entire boss fight based around this mechanic, that can get very frustrating. Also, sometimes my momentum will completely stop when I attack after grappling, sometimes it won't and I end up miles away from where I want to be. I don't know which one is the correct design, but they're both happening, which is inconsistent. It only happens with the grappling hook. Other jumping mechanics, this never happens. So the inconsistency has severely thrown me off, as well as the range seems kind of wonky. Sometimes I can grapple from halfway across my screen, other times I basically have to be right on top of it in order to grapple. I don't know if that has to do with the targeting issue that I was discussing before, or if it has more to do with just the flat range of the ability. But the grappling hook needs a little bit of work, in my opinion. I think that's probably the weakest mechanic in the game, and it can get really, really frustrating. So, otherwise, platforming feels great, combat feels great, them together feels absolutely empowering. Next, we're going to go on to progression, since we talked about empowerment. There are a few primary ways that progression works in Sundered. Every time you die, there is a sort of pseudo-roguelite-esque progression system. I mean, I'm really hesitant to call it that because it's more just a progression system that you can only access after you die or run all the way back to home base / teleport to home base. So I guess it's not really roguelite in that you have to die, but it's more or less the same effect of going back to base. But basically this is a stat skill tree. It's a bunch of nodes connected with a bunch of lines, and some of them cost more experience or money or whatever that you're picking up, and they have larger impacts, and the cost scales. And it's usually focused on survivability, such as increasing health, shield regen, reducing shield downtime, increasing ammo for one of the mechanics you have, increasing the number of jumps you have before you need to recharge, stuff like that. Oh, sorry, dodges, not jumps. But that's the stat tree, and it's a lot of passive boosts. There's some damage bonuses, but it's primarily focused on mobility and survivability. Pretty standard stuff. I think the pricing is fine. I think you feel a significant power boost, which is super important, especially when you're dealing with passive incremental bonuses. If you don't feel like buying 1 to 3 of them does anything, then it gets really annoying when you only can buy 1 to 3 of them because you're stuck in trying to progress and it's the only thing you can do to get better. But every time I've gone back to base and bought a couple skill upgrades, I've felt the effects. I've felt more powerful. I see my health bar move. I see the damage numbers increase and the enemies die faster. So I think they have a nice balance there when it comes to the stat tree and improving your stats passively, which is really important. Additionally, in progression, you have things called perks. These are basically trade-offs. So you get these little tokens that you can slot in your skill tree that are perks that will do something for you. So like getting a small percentage of your health back on hit, but the trade-off or disadvantage is your maximum health is reduced or something like that. They have these for melee combat, for survivability, for your cannon, stuff like that. And they're extremely powerful. I can't tell you how many times I've been saved, my life has been saved by a perk on a run. And they can also help you level up faster and things like that too. So perks are awesome. Also, the perks can be upgraded as well by random chance of drops from rare enemies and chests and things like that. So that's just a progression system within a progression system. It's very nice, very useful, and very important mechanically to the game. The next type of progression is abilities in a Metroidvania game. As you move through the game and beat different bosses or get to different rooms, you end up unlocking different abilities, such as double jump or air dash or your shield and heavy attacks, stuff like that. That is standard. It functions great. They provide them to you after doing fairly difficult runs, which is nice. It feels like a significant reward, and it makes the player feel like what they just did was worthwhile. So I think that was designed pretty well, but the even cooler thing about these abilities is you have the power to boost these things, these active abilities that you're constantly using. You can boost your double jump to have an extra effect that I'm not going to spoil. You can boost your shield to have a retaliation effect, which was particularly funny when I found that out, because that's something I was complaining about in my first impressions video. In fact, the one thing that I was saying I wish was in the game, in fact is in the game, which is why we do these long-term reviews, but I was very pleased to see that that was an option. You just have to go back and upgrade the ability after beating a few bosses and things like that. So not only do you get to evolve your character through the standard collection of abilities, but you can then improve on those abilities. And when you improve those abilities, you feel so powerful after doing it. It is awesome. You just feel like a brand new character. You have this new magical ability that transformed out of something you already had, and you're able to basically integrate it into your standard system of combat and platforming because it's built out of something you already know how to use. I think that's creative and smart, and it just feels so good and intuitive, these different things they can do. And that kind of leads us into power spikes within the game and rolling into difficulty. So we're going to talk about difficulty, which includes power spikes here. Like I said, everything from the passive incremental stat boosts of your stat tree to equipping and leveling up perks, as well as getting new abilities and evolving these abilities, all makes you have this huge power spike feel as when playing as Ash. And that is pretty tight. I love it. I love getting something new after beating a really tough fight and walking in like a badass to the next room and just wreaking havoc. It feels so cool. You're like, man, I got this. This game's easy all of a sudden. And then it slowly starts ramping up, which is going to bring us to the difficulty comments. The best way to describe the difficulty in this game is waves and walls. When you first start the game, you feel weak, you struggle to get through. Every time they introduce a new enemy, you're just like, oh my god, how am I going to deal with that on top of all this other stuff? And then you end up dying, or you go back to base and spend your XP, and you hit that first power spike, and you're like, man, I got this. This is easy all of a sudden. So you start getting that peak on that wave, and then you go and you get past where you were last time, and all of a sudden it starts going downhill as it takes a couple more hits to start beating these different or evolved enemies, or the evolved enemies have new mechanics that you maybe haven't learned how to deal with, and you start getting that lower end of the wave. And then you get to the next thing that gives you the next power spike, and then you reach the next peak, and it feels great again. I think that's awesome. That's going to make players always want to keep playing the game, to reach that next feeling of being a badass, to reach that next peak on that wave of, nothing in this game can touch me. I can just sit here and fight in this room for 30 minutes and never die because I'm just so much stronger all of a sudden. So the waves are really cool, and it's a great incentive to get players to keep playing and not want to put the game down, which is absolutely the feeling I have gotten through the 20 hours of gameplay between me and my team. But then, periodically throughout the game, and particularly the boss fights, the main boss fights, not the mini-bosses, the mini-bosses can do this too. We've had that happen a couple times, but particularly the main bosses. There is a difficulty wall. It is not the low point in a wave. You can, despite what the tooltips say, get to the point where there is nowhere else to go to progress. It says it's non-linear progression, and for the most part it's true, but you will get to a point where the only thing standing between you and the next part of the game is a boss, or a particular mini-boss that you'd have to run around and he'd chase you through the entire dungeon to try and go past. And these walls are just soul-crushing. That's where our gameplay team is at right now, and we're going to push through so that we can do the final review after 100, or at least close to 100% completion on Friday. Is one of the bosses is an absolute wall, and part of that has to do with the grappling hook mechanic, but another part is just raw stats, and it feels like we have to go back and sit there and grind and try to get our stats up so that we can take the extra hits and we can deal the extra damage to get through this fight in a reasonable amount of time to where attrition doesn't just kill us. So these walls are just soul crushing, and it disappoints you after you've done it 7 or 8 times and you've tried improving yourself each time and it still isn't quite enough. That being said, once you scale that wall, you feel unstoppable, and it's arguably higher than the peaks of waves that we discussed before. But the time it takes between failing the fight, starting back at the spawn point, moving back to the boss, going through the fight again and failing, feels like a bunch of wasted time when you have to do it 7, 8, 9 times in a row. It should be noted that we're playing through on normal and this is happening. So, if you're highly skilled at Metroidvania games, I encourage you to try the higher difficulties, because I think the game could get really cool and challenging. But if you're not great at them, then be wary of the higher difficulties, because this game has some serious difficulty walls. That being said, I don't think it's a particular issue, and it definitely encourages players to play more and get better and practice skill sets, but one has to be very careful that it's not too difficult. It needs to be doable at a reasonable broad strand of skill levels, I think. So I think it's in an okay place, but that is one of the few things that is going to need to be reassessed by the time of the final verdict. Next, we're going to talk about the map. The game claims to be procedurally generated, and for the most part, it is. What I mean by that is certain sections of the map remain exactly the same, but these broad, open, they're referred to as caverns, have basically modular rooms that are randomized and shuffled and placed in different orders and linked together differently. That is the procedural generation component. So it's not the entire map. There's specific shortcut rooms that will always be there. There's specific main rooms that are supposed to have mini-bosses or loot or ability gains that you're supposed to get. And those will remain constant. So it's really nice to have that reference point, in fact. And I think it's nice to see that at least a little bit of the world is stable in a game that is very high speed, high intensity a lot of the time. So I think they did a really good job with making the world feel stable, but also different enough each time you go to where you're not like, oh, I'm running through the same room over and over. That being said, the variety of essentially modular rooms feels like it could use a little bit more. It's not bad, it's in an okay place. I don't find myself getting bored looking at the different styles of rooms I'm running through, certainly, but I do clearly recognize duplications or even sets of three of the same room pasted together by their procedural generation system. Which it can happen, and you're not typically spending a lot of time in any given room anyway, so it's not necessarily a big issue. But procedural generation is definitely not a main selling point for the game, and I don't think it was advertised as one. But it was mentioned, and that's kind of the truth behind the procedural generation, is large swaths of the game are, but the variety isn't, huge, it's reasonable, and I don't think it detracts from the game too much. One of the things that is absolutely awesome about the map and level design is a big gripe I've had with other Metroidvania games is your ability to move through the map is clearly limited by your abilities and what you have. That's a standard feature. That's not the issue. The issue is, in a lot of other Metroidvania games, they don't tell you that you can't get past a certain room unless you have a certain ability. You just gotta kind of mess around in the room for a minute until you realize that you probably don't have what you need. While that's an okay way to do it, one thing I absolutely love about Sundered is it says you shouldn't have to waste your time doing that, especially with the level of difficulty to just get to those rooms. So it tells you, if you look at the map, hey, this is either an ability locked room, and there's some minor graphic indication of whether you have the ability to get through it or not, or it's a basically progression locked room and you have to come at it from the right angle or something like that to unlock the door. And that is so nice. It removes an unnecessary element of mystery, and I'm not running all the way across the map just to find out the reason I went there is for something that I can't do. I think it's awesome. I don't know why more Metroidvania games don't do it that way. I love it. I think that's great. It made me so happy when I realized that's what was going on. And the other thing about the map and level designs, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I referred to regions, is when I started playing the game, I kind of expected it to just be this one big block map, because that's one of the features of Metroidvania games, is the map is essentially all linked together. So I thought what I was exploring and seeing was basically the central component of the map, and I'd be able to look at the whole map at once. And that meant the aesthetic was probably going to be roughly the same, some kind of underground mechanical-esque factory-like setting with components of overgrown jungle and things like that. I was pleasantly surprised. You fairly quickly, in fact, roughly immediately after the first boss, or I think you can get to it before you do the first full boss, you find yourself in this absolutely and completely different region. And it loads a different section of the map with essentially your home hub base of your skill tree, where the shard was, being the same throughout all of the regions. But you find yourself in this basically different world, frankly almost a different game graphically. And the enemies are almost completely different, the repertoire of enemies you fight, the mechanics as far as platforming go, and the traps you need to worry about are completely different, and the aesthetic is different, and it just feels like you're in an entirely different world than what you started in, and Sundered itself is its own entirely different world. So you just have these, it's like having your choice of flavors of ice cream all laid out before you, and you're able to go back and forth between them. You have this really dark and evil looking thing, you have this factory looking set of levels, you have this cathedral-esque city looking set of levels, and there may be even another region entirely. We're only 73% through at the time of review. So I'm very excited to see how that plays out. But just, I thought in the one region there were so many beautiful and amazing and complex art assets, but when I discovered there were even more regions and a cave system linking some of them, just the background art style and the enemy art style and everything else about it evolved into this new level that showed this care and attention to detail that was painted onto this beautiful canvas known as Sundered. And it was breathtaking and enticing and terrifying in moments. And it was just one of the coolest experiences to see the dichotomy between the different regions, and just, wow, mind-blowing. Absolutely beautiful and well done. So the level design and map functionality is super cool, and I love it, love it, love it, love it. The bosses, progressing through the bosses, the reason there's a full boss clip included at the end of this video is because I was astounded at the boss fights, particularly the first one, and then again the same kind of feeling on the second and third one, that it was like none of the other fights I had before. It was this entirely different scenario with obviously different mechanics from the enemy, but basically requiring you, based on the map itself, to do something entirely different. And the literal scale of the fight is so much more massive than anything else in the game. The camera actually pulls out, and Esh is just this tiny little person on the screen running around, and the enemy just takes up so much of the screen and just pummels you with different abilities. It's mind-blowing. And it's almost like you stop playing Sundered and you start playing Sundered the boss game, and then when you're done with that boss, you go back to standard Sundered, and it's just really cool. It's, again, that layering of different kind of systems within the game, and it truly makes it feel like an entirely different challenge when you go to fight a boss versus when you're pushing through the level or fighting a mini-boss. I think thematically, it's amazing. I think mechanically, they're ingenious, and I think they're similar enough to where it's not jarring to the player, but significantly different enough so it never feels like you're fighting the same big badass more than once. So I think the boss fights are super cool and super well designed. Frankly, it's a strong selling point alone. One of the things about the bosses, though, as well as just general level and map progression, is when you start unlocking some of the empowered abilities, or indeed some of just the general basic abilities, you're able to kind of not necessarily break the game, but advance to locations that you weren't necessarily intended to by that time, or in ways that the map wasn't intended for you to do, but was there. And ThunderLotus Games has actually spoken to this and said, it's not necessarily a bug or a cheat or an exploit, but more of a feature, because the game isn't designed to be played linearly. They wanted you to have that freedom to explore and find where you're supposed to be. Much like with telling the story and learning the mechanics, they want the player to figure it out on their own. So they want you to figure out what your progression is supposed to be and is appropriate for you, which is really cool. But that being said, it's super funny when you can get certain mechanics in the game and you see that the level is designed to make you go through this long, arduous process of fighting hordes and hordes of enemies, doing this zigzag pattern to climb up this spire, and you're like, well, I have double jump and I have some other fun little abilities that allow me to move vertically, and you just kind of like skip this really tough process and get there, and it's like, yeah, we're not going to punish you for that. You got here. That's the goal. And they actually just say, hey, here's the objective you came here for. They don't care how you did it. The fact that you did it is what's important. And it's just a really cool, freeing feeling to the player. And it's like, hey, I feel like I outsmarted them. It's super duper cool. And it makes me feel smart and clever as the player. But in reality, you know, the game lends itself to that. And it's okay to do that. It's not going to break the game getting away with it, but you may find yourself in a really tough situation if you do it. So I thought that was kind of a neat little flavor to add for the players and say, hey, if you can do it, you're good to go. We don't really want to hold you against doing something that you've figured out how to do. And again, that lends itself to some pretty cool speedrunning stuff. I'd love to see what the world record ends up being, you know, in like a month after release, who can run it the fastest and stuff like that. So that would be pretty cool. But outside of those points, the game is just generally solid. From art and sound, which are all excellent, everything seems appropriate when it comes to that. Just touch up the foreground scenario. It doesn't need to be artificially strengthened as far as difficulty goes. It's already tough enough. Outside of that, graphics and sound is good. Plot, it seems maybe basic, but I feel like there's this underlying twist to the mystery that I haven't been given yet. Outside of that, you don't really care about Esh or the enemy characters very much. You don't learn about them, but you absolutely do want to know more about the world. Combat mechanics are clean and crisp. They mesh together perfectly with the platforming mechanics, and your toolbox certainly grows as you go. The progression is decently layered and most certainly lends itself to making the player feel powerful after completing something difficult. The difficulty is a bit of a struggle. I think for the most part it's okay. There is a slight concern of difficulty walls. I think it's completely playable. You can play around it and just fight through the difficulty walls and eventually get over them. And I think the map and level design is absolutely and truly beautiful. I think the major part about this game that I'm interested in, though, is, and I'm unsure if it's the case, but is it possible to empower all of your abilities? I haven't seen it say it is, and essentially by count, I think you might end up a little short unless the game has more to it than it lets on to. Because I'm pretty sure you may end up with one or two abilities you can't upgrade. Basically, every 3 mini-bosses, you're provided an Elder Shard, and the Elder Shard is how you can empower your abilities. And then main bosses also give it to you. And each region, from what I can tell, has, I think, about 3 mini-bosses. So each region provides 2 shards, and I think you have over 6 active abilities. So you may have to pick and choose and be a little smart about what abilities you upgrade when you play through, and I was not aware of that. So this game is definitely something that has replayability, because there's more than one way to progress through it, and also you have the ability to either corrupt or embrace your powers through the Elder Shards, or there's actually a destruction mechanic and you can go and destroy them. I have not destroyed any shards and don't know if it still upgrades your abilities, but I believe it would. Outside of that, we've done our summary of what we've gone over as far as the deep dive goes, and we've discussed about some very key points and some key concerns within the game. So I think at this point, I'm going to give you a nice hearty goodbye and leave you to watch and enjoy the sounds of the first boss fight, full boss fight, if you're interested in watching it, of Sundered by ThunderLotus Games. This has been the YAGR team with our deep dive. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you online soon.